The auctioneer's voice cracked on lot number 47. It wasn't much, just a split-second waver that most people probably missed. But Richard Holloway heard it. Standing at the back of the crowd, arms crossed tight against the September wind, he heard it. The lot was a 1967 John Deere 4020 diesel. Power steering, synchro-range transmission, original paint still visible under 3 decades of Iowa dirt. Richard's grandfather had ordered it from the dealership in Cedar Rapids with cash, $6,847, counted out in $100 bills on the showroom floor. That was May 1967. The Summer of Love, they called it. Richard was only 2 years old. Now it was September 14th, 1985, and everything his family had built over a century was being sold to the highest bidder. Before I go any further, I need to tell you something about what you're about to hear. This isn't speculation. This isn't me imagining what might have happened. This story is built from documented realities, auction records from Harrison County, Iowa, farm debt statistics from the USDA, Economic Research Service, and the lived experience of thousands of farm families who went through the same hell in the mid-1980s. Some details have been reconstructed to create a narrative, but the economic catastrophe, the human cost, the specific machinery, and the numbers, all of that is entirely real. And if you lived through the farm crisis of the 1980s, if you stood at an auction watching your neighbor's life get sold off piece by piece, or if you were that neighbor, I want to hear your story in the comments. Because this isn't ancient history, this is living memory. This is your story, too. The Holloway farm sat on 640 acres of black Iowa soil, 10 miles north of Missouri Valley. Richard's great-grandfather, James Holloway, had bought the original 160 acres in 1885 for $12 an acre, $1,920 total. He'd paid it off in 7 years, growing corn and raising hogs. By 1920, his son William had expanded to 320 acres. By 1960, Richard's father, Thomas, owned all 640 acres, free and clear. Free and clear. Those words used to mean everything. Richard grew up knowing every field by name, the South 40, the creek bottom, the ridge section, where the topsoil was so thin, nothing grew right. He'd learned to drive on a Farmall M when he was 9 years old, sitting on his father's lap, small hands gripping the steering wheel while Thomas worked the clutch and throttle. He went to Iowa State and studied agricultural economics. He graduated in 1982 with a degree and a head full of ideas about modern farming, efficiency ratios, and economies of scale. The professors had been clear. The future belonged to farmers who thought big, who leveraged their equity to expand, and who adopted the latest technology. Richard came home in May 1982 with big dreams. His father was skeptical. Thomas Holloway was 63 years old and had never borrowed a dime in his life, except for one tractor loan in 1958 that he'd paid off in 18 months. If you can't pay cash, he used to say, you can't afford it. But Richard was 27 and convinced he understood modern agriculture better than his father's generation ever could. He showed Thomas the projections. Corn prices were strong, $3.50 a bushel. Land values were climbing. The farm was worth maybe $2,000 an acre now, which meant they had $1.28 million in equity just sitting there. They could borrow against it. Buy the Anderson place next door, another 480 acres. Invest in new equipment, a big four-wheel drive tractor, a newer combine, maybe even a grain dryer, so they weren't dependent on the co-op's timeline. Thomas looked at the numbers for a long time, then turned to his son and asked, "You sure about this?" Richard was sure. They borrowed $385,000 from Farmers State Bank in January 1983. Interest rate, 14.5%. The loan officer, Dennis Perkins, a high school friend of Richard's, smiled and shook both their hands. Smart move, right? He'd said. Get big or get out, right? That's what they're saying in Washington. They bought the Anderson place for $945,000 and borrowed another $560,000 for that. Then $127,000 for a John Deere 8640, another $89,000 for a used 7700 combine. Total debt by spring 1983, $1,161,000. Thomas signed the papers, but he looked sick doing it. Richard remembered his father's hand shaking as he wrote his name. A man who had never owed money was suddenly over $1 million in debt at age 64. "It'll be fine, don't worry," Richard told him. "The land alone is worth nearly $2 million now. We have plenty of cushion." That was May 1983. By December 1984, corn had dropped to $2.42 a bushel. Land values plummeted. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker had jacked interest rates to record highs to crush inflation, and agricultural commodity prices collapsed as a result. The dollar was strong, making American grain too expensive for overseas buyers. Soviet imports dried up. The export markets everyone counted on simply vanished. The first payment was due January 15, 1984, $178,455. They made it, but just barely. The 1985 payment was impossible. The letters started coming in March, formal notices on bank letterhead, words like delinquent, default, and foreclosure. Words that had never existed in the Holloway vocabulary. Thomas stopped sleeping. Richard would find him at 3 a.m., sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, staring at nothing. One day, Richard asked what he was thinking about. "Your grandfather," Thomas said quietly. "I wonder what he'd think if he could see this." By June, the bank initiated foreclosure. Everything was to be sold. Richard hired a lawyer for $8,000 they didn't have, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, tried to reorganize. Nothing worked. The numbers were gone. At $2.10 corn and land values below $1,400 an acre, there was no way to service the debt. The lawyer was blunt. "I'm sorry, there's nothing else I can do. The auction is September 14th. Thomas suffered a mild stroke on August 23rd. The doctor said there was no permanent damage, but Richard knew better. His father was broken. A man who inherited a debt-free farm was losing everything because his son convinced him to bet it all on textbook theories. The auction was held on the farm itself. A crowd gathered at 9 a.m. neighbors, speculators, and those who came just to watch, the way people slow down to look at car accidents. The auctioneer, Carl Brenner, stood on a flatbed trailer. "Everything must go," he announced. "Cash or cashier's check." The land went first. A 160 acres of the family homestead, in the family for a century, was bought by a man in a Mercedes who didn't even get out of his car. Total land revenue, $867,000. They still owed the bank nearly $300,000. Then came the equipment. The bidding was brutal. Machines that were worth a fortune 2 years ago sold for pennies. Richard watched from the back. Every lot was a reminder of his arrogance. Lot 47. At 2 p.m. they reached the older machinery. Lot 47, the 1967 John Deere 4020. "Let's start the bidding at $5,000, Brenner called out. The price climbed slowly. $6,000, $6,500. Richard had $2,650 in cash from his savings and selling his grandfather's silver pocket watch. He also had a Visa card with a $6,000 limit. When he'd have to run to the bank across the street for a cash advance with a 21.9% interest rate. He didn't care. $7,000. Do I hear $7,500? Richard raised his hand. Silence fell over the yard. That's when Carl Brenner's voice cracked. He stopped. He cleared his throat, pulled out a handkerchief, and turned away from the microphone. When he turned back, his eyes were wet. He was a professional, but watching a young man try to buy back his own grandfather's legacy with money he didn't have, something broke. "Sold," Brenner whispered into the mic, "for $7,500 to Richard Holloway." The crowd was silent for a moment. Then a slow, measured applause began. Richard walked up to sign the papers, his hands shaking. Brenner handed him the keys without looking him in the eye. "Good luck? A son," he said. Richard drove the 4020 off the farm that evening as the sun set, past the fields he'd known his whole life, to a small rental house. When he walked inside, Thomas was in his chair. "I got the 4020, Richard said. His father nodded. "Your grandfather would have liked that." "It's been 40 years. The Holloway farm is owned by a corporation in Chicago now. No one lives there. The house was torn down in 1993. Richard never farmed again. He worked at the co-op until he retired in 2018. But he still has the 4020 in his garage. He starts it every few months. Sometimes he just sits in the cab. The seat still smells like his grandfather's pipe tobacco. He sits there, gripping the worn steering wheel, remembering. If this story meant something to you, please consider subscribing to the channel. A small gesture like clicking that button means a lot to me. It lets me know that the time spent sharing these stories is worth it. Thank you for listening.